Hello, everyone. Thank you again for joining the Startup Societies Foundation podcast. Today, we're joined by Efosa Ojomo. He is the author of The Prosperity Paradox, How Innovations Can Lift Nations Out of Poverty. Efosa, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well, Joe. Thanks for asking. The weather is it's a bit dreary here in Boston, but I'm doing great. Thank you.
That's usually the case with Boston. I'm in Barranquilla, and the weather is always the same, the opposite of Boston. Well, excellent. So, first of all, you do some interesting work. I mean, for one, you are an author, but you also work at the Clayton Christensen Institute. It focuses mostly on disruption and using theories in order to predict the future rather than empirical evidence. Can you just kind of unpack the mission, objectives, and strategy of that institute?
Yes, absolutely. And so we're named after the father of disruptive innovation, Harvard Business School professor Clayton Christensen. He co-founded this institute about 11 or so years ago. And he had this thinking about 25 years ago, before he was starting his academic career, that, the way he tells it is God did not create data about the future. But yet we live in a future-oriented world. And so if you think about it, every piece of data you have is about the past. There's no data about the future. Predictions, but no data. And so if you live in a future-oriented world and every piece of data you have is about the past, how are you supposed to survive? And that's really where theories come into the picture. And theories are simply statements of causality. And so theories are, if I go to the gym every day, I'm going to lose weight. If I eat better, my health will improve. That's a theory. Right? It might not be the most rigorous theory, but that's a theory. So we're all consumers of theory. And so to connect it to the Institute, the Christensen Institute really exists to apply theories to some of the most pressing problems in our world. Healthcare, which is a big issue in the US and globally. Education, which is becoming more of an issue with regards to how we train the future generation for the workforce. And most recently, what we're calling global prosperity. And that is applying many of these theories that Professor Christensen has developed to the problem of global poverty and how to create prosperity in many countries around the world.
Excellent. And it's a very interesting approach to social problems. Now, I have a question. I don't want to peg your institute as following any specific school of thought in terms of theories, and Startup Societies Foundation believes in all forms of ideologies and strategies to achieving better governance. But this theory-centric, less empirical view, it sounds very similar to a traditional Austrian economic school of thought.
So I think the way we think about it, it's not as if we don't use data to develop our theories. We do, but we depend on theories more so than data, because data essentially represents a phenomenon and data is not the phenomenon. And so if I could give a quick example, before humans could predictably fly, if you looked at the data on what correlated with flight, you would have found a lot of things that could fly had winged feathers. And so a lot of guys strapped winged feathers to their backs, jumped off of buildings, and fell to their deaths. It wasn't until the Swiss mathematician and physicist, Daniel Bernoulli, helped us sort of better understand fluid mechanics and was able to come up with this concept called lift. And we started to understand flight a lot better. We weren't perfect at it at first, but ultimately we understood in this circumstance, here's what you need to fly. In this other circumstance, here are things you need to fly. So after every crash, and as I was explaining earlier, you can think of a crash as an anomaly. So after every anomaly, we went back and said, how can we improve this theory so that it can be more robust? And now that sort of has led us to where we are today. And so I think for us at the Institute, that's really how we think about what a theory is, what it represents, and how you can, over time, make it a lot more robust.
Interesting. So this theoretical understanding is specifically applied to disruption. What are some of the theoretical underpinnings or your theoretical understanding of the very concept of disruption?
Yes. So most theories start with a simple question. Disruption sort of lives in the world of management theory. And so management theory essentially tries to explain why do some organizations do well, why do some not, why do some survive in turbulent times and others don't. And so a lot of theories have come out of that. So the notion of a level 5 leader, so you think about Jim Collins and that notion of a level 5 leader leading the helm of many great organizations, that's an example of a theory. So for disruption, the simple question Clay Christensen was trying to answer is, why do great firms fail, especially at the hand of upstarts or startups? And there were a lot of ideas out there. I mean, some where it was management and leadership. Some where the great firms were just not quick enough to respond to the technological change happening at the time. And when he looked at all the different answers on why great firms failed, especially at the hand of startups, he said that's not good enough, because how do you say a great management team was amazing 2 years ago, and then all of a sudden today, because they got disrupted, they're no longer amazing? How do you just lose all your brain cells in such a short period of time? And he dug into it and analyzed several industries: the disk drive industry, the steel industry, the excavator industry. He analyzed several industries, and he began to understand how new technologies that get introduced to certain industries that aren't as good, technically speaking, aren't as feature rich as what the incumbents in the industry are using. When that happens, the incumbents in the industry almost always fall victim to disruptive threat, or to disruption. And that was sort of the answer he came up with. It was disruptive innovation, which essentially explains when a new innovation comes into the market that's not as good, not as fully featured, but it's targeted at customers who are currently being overserved by existing products in the industry. And so think about how overserved many of us are when we go to hotels, Airbnb. It doesn't quite, at least at the onset, it wasn't quite as good. And you were living in or staying at random people's homes, but it was good enough. And you can see how over time it has become better and better and better. And it's what we would call a disruptive innovation.
So you've cornered at least two big markets that you said are ripe for disruption. How do you use your theories of disruption in order to determine which sectors are ripe for it?
That's excellent, because if you can't identify where the theory fits, then what's the point of a theory? There are a couple of questions you want to ask. The first is, are there customers that are being overserved in this industry? And what do we define by customers who are being overserved? Right? You're being sold a product, and you hardly use a lot of the features that are given to you in the product. But the features are such a part and parcel of the organization, the seller's business model, that they really can't even take it out. And so that's one. The second is there non-consumption in a particular industry? And essentially what that means is, are there people who would want to consume a particular product or a service, but because of the existing products and services that are available, they can't afford them. The ones on the market aren't affordable enough. They require way too much technical expertise or too much time. And so when you start with those two questions, that almost always gives you a sign for disruptive opportunity. Now, notice how those two questions are very different from what the questions the incumbents would be asking, which are, I wake up every day and I sell Joe a cup of coffee. He's already a consumer, but I want Joe to come back every day, so I'm going to give him more flavors. I'm going to try to sell him a latte, upsell him. I'm going to use a different cup that he might prefer. So incumbent companies are laser focused on their existing customers, keeping them happy, helping them, in a way, spend more money on the products they're already selling. And we call those innovations, which are important, we call them sustaining innovations. But there's going to come a time where they begin to overserve the existing customers. And when that happens, they are going to be in trouble because it means disruption is afoot.
In Peter Thiel's book, 0 to 1, he also describes that type of innovation as a 0 to 1, meaning you're creating something completely new and out of the blue, versus a 1 to N, which is iterative change or improvements upon it. So what you're recommending as an organization is that we try to seek out more 0 to 1 innovations rather than simply iterative innovations.
Well, yes, Thiel is correct. In our language, we would call them market creating innovations, and we talk about that in our book. And so you essentially create a market that did not exist before. And so if you think about the market for cars, it goes back to Henry Ford in 1908. He completely created a new market for cars. I mean, he wasn't the inventor of cars, but he's the one who democratized cars. He made them simple and affordable so many people could afford them. And what's interesting about that is when you go that route to create a new market from 0 to 1, as Thiel talks about, your innovation is no longer just about the car. It's about everything that now surrounds the car. It's about creating an ecosystem, which is why it's tough to do. Right? Because now it's about creating gas stations. It's about making sure there are service stations so people can go and get their car fixed. It's about making sure you have enough rubber coming in so you can make your tires, and glass and steel. And when you look at what market creators have to do in order to get a market from 0 to 1, you start to see all these other components, which you could call an ecosystem, that they have to essentially pull into the economy. And that's why one of the reasons why it's hard to create a market. But if you're able to do it, you become extremely, extremely successful. Yeah, I agree with that thought.
So it's one of your contentions of your organization, of your book, is that we should focus less on poverty reduction, more on prosperity. And one of the ways is through disruption and market creation. But in many of these countries, in all the countries around the world, there's extraordinary legal barriers or regulatory barriers or policy barriers to entry to create these new markets. In fact, Thiel talks about we could be living in a much more technically advanced world, but we have many barriers to that. And because of the internet, it's one of those last few places, most of the innovation has been taking place in the software space. So as someone who's looking at these barriers to creating new markets and creating disruptions, what would you recommend to people in our space who are trying to innovate governance? What type of policies they should pursue in order to allow for more flourishing of disruptive, innovative companies?
Yes, so I think the first thing our book, The Prosperity Paradox, tries to do is really explain the different types of innovations and how they connect to different aspects of an economy. Institution building, corruption even, and infrastructure. Those are three things we try to focus on. And you're absolutely correct in the sense that regulations increase the barriers for innovation to happen. And so the first thing we would suggest from the entrepreneur standpoint, and we could talk about policy here in a second, but from the entrepreneur standpoint, we would recognize first and foremost that many emerging markets in some ways are at a disadvantage because it's a lot easier to regulate than it is to innovate. And when they look at many of the regulations that have happened in wealthy countries, they very easily adopt those regulations because on paper, the regulations make a lot of sense. But if you look at the evolution of regulation in now wealthy countries, regulations almost always came after the innovations. And so a simple example I like to tell my friends is you didn't have traffic lights and speed limits before the car. You had the innovation, you had the creation of a new market, and then as people in society began to use the innovations, we began to regulate it in a way that now made it more conducive for living. So we reduced accidents on the roads and so on and so forth. But if you go to an emerging market today, they've adopted, or many of them adopt these regulations, but don't have the innovations. And that's important because the innovations ultimately pay for the regulations. Because like I said, it does increase the cost. So we want to recognize that. That's the first thing we want to do. The second thing is understand that many emerging markets have these regulations, but they also have access to technologies and innovations at a much cheaper rate than many of the countries that actually created them. And so it's sort of they've got the technologies and the innovations, but they also, have the regulations. So it's recognizing that as well. And then the third thing they'd have to do is figure out how to innovate beyond the reach of regulations. And that's hard to do, but that's really where you can begin to create new markets and create a lot of prosperity. Because the minute you innovate within the bounds of the regulation, that becomes increasingly difficult. And so an example I'll give here is a company we write about in Mexico called Clínicas del Azúcar. Now, this company is essentially a chain of diabetes clinics. Before going into that business, the founder, Javier Lozano, looks at the industry and says, it's going to cost me about $1,000 to $1,500 to develop a service that could treat someone with diabetes in Mexico. Many people can't afford that. I'm going to have a nonprofit that raises the money. There were just many things that he would have to do in order to live underneath the umbrella of existing regulations and the way people were getting treatment. He took a step back and said, how can I leverage technology to help me reduce my cost and get me beyond the reach of the regulators? And so he developed an entirely different business model that now helps many Mexicans manage their diabetes. It's sort of a one-stop shop clinic. It's not a full-blown hospital. It's not even a full-blown clinic. Focus only on diabetes care, which limits the amount of regulatory oversight that they would have to live by, leverages technology extensively. So he automates all the data, digitizes all the data, automates data entry where he can. And as a result, he's been able to reduce the cost to about $250 a year, and now has one of the biggest diabetes treatment centers or clinics in Mexico. It's a chain of clinics. And so it does require a different kind of thinking, and we recognize it's not easy. If it were easy, we wouldn't be doing this podcast, but it is possible. And I think that's one of the big things we want people to take away from our work.
So there is these enormous barriers that you talk about. It is very difficult. And it almost makes me think that one of these so-called industries that needs to be disrupted is governance itself. Governance if we imagine governance as a service, it's high cost, it's not providing the quality of service that people want, and to change it, it is ludicrously expensive, not just in monetary cost, but also political costs, maybe even revolutions or a change in government. Do you think that government fits the classification based on the theories that the Christian Institute discusses?
So that's a tough one, and that might be one area where we can push the limits of the theory. The short answer I would give is I'm not 100% sure, right? Because disruptive innovation was developed under a set of certain boundaries, right? You had customers, they could choose what products they wanted to buy. The cost to go from an existing incumbent product to a new entrant, a disruptive startup, was almost nothing. In fact, I might have even gained more value because it cost me less. When you start to think about governments and the products they offer, they are the only players in town. And so when you think about security, when you think about nationalism, I mean, I'm American. If I go to Austria, I'm not Austrian. If I go to Mexico, I'm not Mexican. And so that's going to stretch the theory. Now, to your point about revolutions or a change in government, if the fundamental dynamics of what a government is and who the people are doesn't change, then really all we're changing are the people in the government, and which is quite different from when you think about disruptive innovations, because you are actually changing the fundamental business model, where you're literally going from Blockbuster, where you have stores and videos, and I got to go borrow a video, I've got late fees, to Netflix, where they first started mailing the thing to you, and now you stream. With governments, you essentially just have different people at the helm of Blockbuster. And they may decide to change the business model to Netflix, but they often don't. And there are many reasons why they don't, right? I mean, many of them have only 2 years to perform, some 4 years. So the dynamics, when you start to think about governments, are quite different. The thing we would say is understand the capabilities and limitations of entities, of governments. And so if I understand that a government official is going to be in power for 2 years, the second year, he or she may be trying to run for re-election, that informs the things that I can reasonably expect from them, right? And so I haven't, like I said, my short answer was I don't know. But as I think about it, I'm like, man, it would be an interesting research project, just thinking about, what does it mean to disrupt a government and so on. But those are just some of the things that have come to mind as you asked that question.
So I'm glad that you centered around the very key element of governance, which is monopoly. They are the only game in town, so to speak. But the reason why I asked this question is because there is two trends that one has existed for only about 10 years, which is blockchain, and others existed for about 60, which is special economic zones. That sort of breaks that dynamic of large nation states and a monopoly of force. In the case of special economic zones, because of the small size of these jurisdictions, they're more opt-in and they have to be more competitive. Or even the case of smaller jurisdictions that are sovereign entities like Singapore or Liechtenstein or Monaco, they have to be incredibly competitive. They aren't the only game in town. They're only perhaps even a mile away from the nearest jurisdiction. So they need to do everything in their power in order to remain competitive. In the case of blockchain technology, a lot of their services, which can do a lot of rule-based governing, would be entirely opt-in and not based on geography at all. Do you think that could possibly change the dynamic and sort of lead towards a disruption?
So it can, and you talked about two things, SEZ, Special Economic Zones, and blockchain. Special economic zones are interesting. I think when I start to think about what or who gives special economic zones their power, it's typically the government. And so it's hard to divorce SEZs from from the government, even though they are somewhat autonomous and they have their own tax laws and import-export duties and so on, right? But the Indian government decides to set up a special economic zone, right, with those rules.
Of course,
and so
I want to clarify that host nations, they are the predominant sovereign force, that we're not recommending that changes at all, but it certainly changes the dynamics of it. Sorry for interrupting. I just wanted to mention that.
Oh, no, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It does change the dynamics. And I think that is one way to accelerate economic development and prosperity. I really do. I think if you create an autonomous unit, which is essentially what an SEZ is, and say, here's your mandate, and your charter is to, do whatever you want, but here are the outputs you must adhere to. There's a parallel to the disruption theory, where if you have an incumbent organization, so if you go back to the example of Blockbuster, if you say, okay, Blockbuster, here's your existing business model, brick and mortar, but you have to actually create another business that can compete with this new entrant, this new startup, Netflix. To do that under the umbrella of the existing Blockbuster wouldn't work. So you'd have to separate them. And I think SEZs do an excellent job of that special economic zone. Now, blockchain is really interesting because blockchain has the potential to upend. I want to use the word disrupt carefully because it now means any and everything, but it does have the potential to upend and render obsolete many institutions we currently have in society. So I'll give you just one or two examples. So if you think about property rights and how they're managed in many emerging markets, and even in rich countries, you have an institution, maybe a Ministry of Lands, and that's where you register land, you register your physical property. Well, there's a lot of corruption, a lot of mismanagement, lots of, this is my land, somebody else comes and says it's mine, I take them to court, I can't build. It slows down a lot of progress. And Hernando de Soto has written about this a lot in the mystery of capitalism. And that's just one aspect. We're not talking about starting a business. We're not talking about hiring, labor law. We're just talking about this land, property, so on. Now think about what it would look like to have all these properties on the ledger, on the blockchain, right? Now, you have that transparency, that's number one. You have if I would, the unchangeability of it, the robustness of the ledger. And so if property belongs to you, Joe, I can't come the following day without doing a lot of hard work, but I don't even know how I would do it. At least I'm not technically able, but I can't come and say, no, that's mine. Now, what that means is the number of court cases that get brought up for me saying, you've got my land, I'm saying I've got yours, reduced drastically, because now we have a system that explains everything. It's fairly transparent. I could do a transaction with you, put it on the chain, you transfer your assets to me. And so the potential is not just in currency or in making it easy for me to give you assets and so on, but it actually will have a back-end impact on the amount of money it takes to build these what I would call Western-style institutions, right? So the courts, the capital markets, and so on. And so that trust that we have in many of the institutions in the US or in Europe now gets transferred to the blockchain, and that reduces the amount of money that we have to spend on building replicas of these institutions that have taken hundreds of years and trillions of dollars to build and maintain. And so there's a lot of hope there. When you start to talk about things like defense and security, that's a different issue. But I definitely think there's a lot of potential for blockchain to impact governance in that way.
Agreed. Property registration is probably the most promising. Not only does it add transparency and robustness, governments can come and go, but an immutable, so to speak, ledger stays around. And also the type of automation that can occur with transferring property titles greatly, drastically reduce the cost of many businesses or people that are trying to mortgage a house or put it up for a loan. So that could tremendously help as well. There's also a lot of applications in identity. But the problem with all of these, a lot of blockchain theorists or blockchain practitioners, is they imagine a world where there isn't governmental buy-in. As you mentioned before, even especially with SEZs, they aren't operating in isolation. They're not sovereign entities. It doesn't matter if you have a property title registered on the blockchain if you don't have a government that recognizes it. What are some strategies that entrepreneurs can do to get buy-in from states to recognize these sort of disruptive technologies in blockchain tech, or just disruptions in general?
Yeah, so Joe, you've asked a lot of good questions. That's probably one of the best. You've asked a lot of good ones. But the first thing I would recommend is understand what organizations are. The government is the government. Whether you like them or not, whether you believe in them or not, whether like that's besides the point. But you have to understand what organizations are. So it's like, I tell people, it's like gravity. I may or may not like gravity, but I have to abide by it. And so what that means is, if I'm an entrepreneur, I have to figure out how to develop an innovation that helps the government make more money, if that is their goal, that helps the government, if they're politicians that are elected, stay in power longer. I have to, my business model has to align with their business model and their objectives. In our theories, we call this understanding the job to be done. And we might not like it, we might fight with it, or they don't, but they shouldn't have to. But that's not research. Research doesn't ask what should I do, what shouldn't I do. Research is about what is and what isn't. And so in our book, we have a chapter titled "Corruption is Not the Problem, It's a Solution." And it's not the solution, it's not a good solution, but it's a solution. In other words, we say many people in poor economies don't have productive ways to solve their problems. Corruption becomes the most efficient and most productive, so they go that route. Now, to ask them to fire corruption, to say stop being corrupt without giving them a viable alternative is not very realistic. And so we essentially wrote about the histories of now, what we would call clean countries and regions, and how they battled with corruption. And it's actually a very elegant chapter. And an entrepreneur has to have a similar mindset. So if I'm developing a business model, I have to think about the government and governance institutions that will be affected. I have to make sure my business helps them become more relevant in society, even though it makes things more efficient and over time it begins to obviate their relevance. But that is really what a disruptive innovation does, right? I mean, a lot of times the incumbents look at the disruption and they either ignore it or they flee and say, I don't even want to touch that. So as opposed to a startup or an entrant going in and trying to fight the government. And so, to summarize, I really think if a startup thinks about blockchain and how to introduce it to digitize a lot of records, for instance, and get them on the ledger, the question then becomes, how do I make this productive for that government body that is in charge of this? Not how do I get them out of work? How do I get them out of business? If you have that mindset, and I really think you can make a lot of progress.
Excellent. I think that's really practical for a lot of our listeners. A lot of our listeners are people that actually are in the field of trying to cause disruptions in governance, either through blockchain technology or special economic zones or studies or related to those fields. And because of that, our listeners want some practical advice in terms of how to move forward in that. So the last question I have for you is, what is some advice that you would give entrepreneurs that are moving forward in a disruptive space, maybe even for character? Like, what type of skills or resources should you employ in order to endure over what will be an arduous and long process?
Well, many of the words that have come out of my mouth are very they're things like perseverance, patience, persistence, and you have to keep reminding yourself, if this were easy, other people would have done it. There's a reason it's difficult, because the value that the entrepreneur and society are going to extract from this solution that they create is going to be immense. And so, the answer to those questions are really, words that will serve us well in our relationships with our friends and our families. And it's just those things, right? Because if you don't have them, if you're looking for a quick buck, then it's going to be incredibly difficult. The other thing is understanding that you also want people who have similar values. I mean, you can have somebody that's technically savvy, but if they want to make a quick buck, it's incredibly difficult. And so hiring people or working with people who have very similar values. I guess the last thing I would say is you really want to focus on understanding what your solution is what value your solution is gonna bring to every single person involved in the equation. So if it's customers, what value is it really gonna bring? If it's your stakeholders, shareholders, what value? The governments, what value? If you can articulate that really well and really simply, and if everybody doesn't stand to be better off, then that's going to become really difficult. Really difficult.
Well, thank you so much, Efosa. I think you have some incredible advice for the rest of us and some really good insights. I recommend that everyone read The Prosperity Paradox, How Innovation Can Lift Nations Out of Poverty, and check out the Clayton Christensen Institute for Disruptive Innovation. Efosa, thank you so much. I think everyone should listen to your work and all that you do.